I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. This is my 2024 complete reading thumbnail review of every book that I read. And I read about 109 books this year, or 109 things that are listed on my reading challenge for Goodreads. So some of them are novelettes or journal issues, but we'll get to it. So back in January of this year, I was commuting to work on the bus a little bit further than for many years. I've been walking to work, and before I switched jobs in February, the month of January, I was making a long commute on the bus. So you'll see January and February, I completed a lot of books. But the first book I finished reading was Augmented, Volume 1. It's the choir science fiction anthology, and I have a story in there, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but yeah, it's a really good book, co-edited by Matt Stefano and Keith Giles, my editors at Choir, and there's some really good science fiction in there. And my story, Happy Click Click, is in there. So the first book that I've finished of the year was The Instrumentality of Mankind by Cordwainer Smith. So a retro read. And right after that, I read The Planet Buyer by Cordwainer Smith. So Cordwainer Smith was an interesting science fiction writer who died far too young. But Cordwainer Smith was the pen name of Paul Lineberger, who worked for the State Department, taught at Johns Hopkins, and he actually wrote a history of psychological warfare under his real name. Very interesting guy. But so he has this one kind of universe he was building in the far future, and that most of the stories in The Instrumentality of Mankind were a collection of, and they're very, very good. And The Planet Buyer is the Hugo Award nominated novel, his only novel that was eventually expanded into another edition called Nostralia, but that's just additional material added to The Planet Buyer. And most of the covers of The Planet Buyer look really cheesy, but everything by Cordwainer Smith is top notch. It's very good stuff. He was first recommended to me by Brian Evanson, the great Brian Evanson. So big fan. And so the next thing I read was the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction November-December 2023 issue, edited by Sherry Renee Thomas. And the cover story, The Many Different Kinds of Love by Jeff Ryam, I think, and David Jeffrey, who had, excuse me, a novella in there, were the standouts of that issue. Keeping with the retro reads, the next thing I read was The Female Man by Joanna Russ, classic of feminist time travel and just generally weird science fiction. It's very good. Joanna Russ is a highly respected science fiction author that was active in the 60s and 70s. So yeah, I read that. And then I read Shrapnel Contemplations by Lance Olson, that's put out by my co-host on Dickheads, his publishing company, Anti-Oedipus Press. D. Harlan Wilson put out Shrapnel, and it's mostly essays and you know um, academic type musings, but very cutting, biting stuff. I liked it. And then back to the old school stuff. I was really in a mood there at the beginning of the year, and I read Nerves by Lester Del Rey. This is kind of like the China Syndrome, but it was written in the 40s. So it's an atomic accident written before the atomic era really took off. So pretty phenomenal prediction by Lester Del Rey. Although I read the edition that was put into paperback in the 50s, so it was slightly edited um, from the 40s version. Then I read a modern science or modern weird fiction novel. It's kind of fantasy, kind of horror, kind of science fiction, and that is "We Are the Crisis" by Cadwell Turnbull. The second book in the Convergence saga. I had him on this podcast to talk about the first book, and it's real activist themed, anarchist themed fiction. So, but good modern science fiction because I've done a lot of retro stuff here already. And next up was the Way the Future Was, a memoir by Frederick Paul, the classic science fiction writer, editor, member of the Futurians. Sorry about the coughing. And this memoir is a must read for people who love the history of science fiction because it has lots of details on how Frederick Paul got into science fiction in the kind of pioneer days of the genre. He started reading amazing stories before the genre had a name. So, very interesting stuff. Then I read Fever House by Keith Rawson, which is an incredible book. Just to show you how good the year was, I thought this was a shoe in for my top 10 reads of the year, and it didn't make the top 10, but it's really good. But you know whose top 10 it did make was Stephen King. Stephen King loved Fever House. So I think Keith would rather Uncle Steve like it more than me. Um, and but I did love it. This is a horror crime noir thing set in Portland, and it's about members of a rock band, and there's the devil's hand chopped off and hidden in a freezer. But it's got kind of a crime thing. It's very good. The sequel I have not read yet. I am very excited to read because it goes much darker places. And then I read back to the retro reads, but not quite so old, is Riding the Torch, a science fiction novel by Norman Spinrad. And man, this is really good. It's about novella length, but it has illustrations, and this is more straight spaceship science fiction, but it's done really, really well, very well written. Yeah, I can't say enough about Riding the Torch by Norman Spinrad. Of course, if you want to see my detailed thoughts, all these have reviews up on my blog spot, davidagranoff.blogspot. So Desperate Measures by David Mack, which is a Star Trek Desperate Measures, which is a prequel to Star Trek Discovery. So it's a Shinzon novel about Michelle Yeoh's the captain she played in Star Trek Discovery, and Burnham, um, and that whole crew. Like it's a story with them, and it happens to have Christopher Pike and Star Trek in it, which or in the Enterprise in it, and David Mack told me some funny stories about how they told him, like, don't worry, we're not touching this and that, and of course they ended up doing all of those things in Discovery. So there's a few things that kind of got knocked out of canon in there, but it's very good. It has ancient civilizations and some interesting Spock and Burnham moments, and I really like Captain Giorgio in here and makes me want more Shinzon novels. Um, so yeah, get on that, Paramount, Simon and Schuster. And you know who you could hire to write them? The guy wearing the Star Trek shirt right here. Yeah, I would love to work on those. I'm not David Mack's not the only David that could write Star Trek. So then February, that was everything I read in January. Like I said, I was reading a lot. That Star Trek Desperate Measures I listened to on audio. Um, February. The first book I read in February was The Whole Man by John Brunner, which is kind of a psychic powers novel. It is not my favorite Brunner. There was some interesting things to be had in that book, but it wasn't fantastic. I mean, it's John Brunner, so it's good, but it's just not as good as some of his classics. And yeah, so then one of the best books of the year that I read, which was The Circumference of the World by Lavi, sorry, excuse me, Circumference of the World by Lavi Tidar. This is an amazing modern science fiction novel that comments on the genre. It's very weird. It helps if you know things about your Philip K. Dicks, your L. Ron Hubbards, your Isaac Asimovs. If you know some of this history and some of these things, it's a little bit better of a novel. But it has a lot of really wonderful things going on. I loved Circumference of the World. It is a great meta commentary on science fiction, and I'll be talking about it deeper in my top reads of the year because, spoiler alert, it made it. So next, I reread the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge for the third or fourth time, the Philip K. Dick classic. And the reason I reread it is because I was doing the Dickopedia entries for our work in progress on the Philip K. Dick Encyclopedia. So I reread it and wrote all the Dickopedia entries. So that's why I reread that. Then Seekers of Tomorrow by Sam Moskowitz, which Stanley Weader said was his inspiration for doing the Dark Dreamers and Dark Visions books. And these are great old interviews with science fiction authors from the Golden Age. And I used a lot of that for the basis for my First Contacts article on my Amazing Stories column on the first science fiction that the authors read. Most of those came from Seekers of Tomorrow. And then for this podcast, the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, I read the novelette The Roads Must Roll by Robert A. Heinlein. So if you want more details on that, Ted Hand joined me, and I can't remember. I feel terrible. I don't remember who the third guest was. But it's a part of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. It was February, guys. People, persons. Um, Roads Must Roll is a classic for a reason. It's a very interesting 1940s science fictional experiment. Does it hold up great? I don't know. I guess. Yeah. Next, I read Sister Maiden Monster by Lucy A. Snyder. I really enjoyed this horror novel. It's a really interesting and weird monster novel. Lucy came on this podcast to talk about it. So there's a whole episode there that you can search back and listen to that. Some years I think that novel would have been good enough to make my top 10s of the year. Not this year, but it's really good. Next, I read the Orville Sympathy for the Devil, which was an audio book written by Seth MacFarlane. I think he probably wrote a teleplay and it was adapted into the novella. And this is a really interesting because it's the only Orville audiobook or novel that we have. Again, I would love to write Orville novels. I have an idea for one. Uh, anyways, the Orville sympathy for the devil is interesting because as a um, as the only Orville um, uh, you know non TV show material, the first like hour of the audiobook has nothing to do with the Orville, or it doesn't seem like it does. But it's setting up a twist, and it's a good twist. I'm not sure many Orville fans are patient enough to wait for it, but I did like it. And that's the Orville Sympathy for the Devil. Give us more Orville audio adventures or novels, and let me write them, please. Um, Psychological Warfare by Paul A. Linebarger, which of course is the legal name of Cordwainer Smith. And I read his history of psychological warfare, which is pretty dry. And I don't recommend it. Everyone run out and read this unless you're just really, really curious about Cordwainer Smith. The next one that I read in March. I read Puttering About in a Small Land by one Philip K. Dick. This is one of the posthumous mainstream novels, although he wrote it in the 50s. And we did a whole episode of the Dickheads podcast about it, guest starring Frank Hollander. So go listen to that. Um, and next up, I read, and this is, I was still working at Pioneer, so I was making the long commute on the bus at this point. So through the beginning part of March, I'm still getting a lot of reading done that way. Um, so the second thing I read in March was The Tusks of Extinction by Ray Naylor. And Ray is quickly becoming one of my favorite authors. I mean, this is only his second book, but his first novel, Mountain and the Sea, was my top read of the year last year. Tusks of Extinction, I have a hard time putting it in the top reads of the year. It's a very short novella. It's only 100 pages. But there's an argument to be made that it's one of the best books I read of the year because it's a fantastic ecological science fiction allegory. It's incredible. It's very, very, very good. Um, the next thing that I read was The Reformatory by Toronto Reeves Dew. Um, it's funny when I make my favorite reads of the year. This might be the best novel I read all year. But I list by how much I enjoy or, what I consider my favorite reads of the year. And this is not a fun read, although there are fun moments. Uh, but this is a very tough book, and it won the Bram Stoker Award for Best Novel. I think it won the Shirley Jackson. Well deserved. This is an incredible, incredible historical horror novel with an amazing backstory, and everyone should read The Reformatory. It is incredible. Next up, I read for the podcast. Oh, and Tusk of Extinction. I had Ray Naylor on to talk about that one as well. And he was on for Mountain in the Sea as well. And hopefully soon I'll be covering his second novel. Also, guest on the podcast. Next two authors Star Trek Picard Firewall by David Mack. So this is the second David Mack Star Trek novel I've read of the year. This is his newest one. And Picard Firewall is the backstory of Seven of Nine um, becoming a Fenris Ranger that led up to the events of Star Trek Picard. I seethe with jealousy that David Mack got to write this because as soon as he had the same thought I did, like as soon as they introduced Seven of Nine and Picard, which is that backstory would be delicious. But David Mack was in a position to actually call his agent and like make it happen. So good on you, sir. And he also gets credit for the first person to put the term mosh and a mosh pit into Star Trek. Um, and yeah, and by the way, bonus. anti-LGBT right wingers hated um, this novel because David gave a backstory to Seven of Nine, deciding that she was a lesbian. So uh, good on him. So the next book is one of the best books of the year that I read, which was Incidents Around the House by Josh Mallerman. I had Josh on to talk about Spin a Black Yarn last year, but we got a little tiny bit into Incidents Around the House because I had already read it, but it wasn't out yet. So Josh and I talked a little bit about that. This is a first person narrative told from a child's perspective. It doesn't cheat. And I had the feeling that Josh could not keep this up for the whole book, but he did. And not only did he keep it up, he did an amazing job. This is an incredible, tense and scary horror novel. I will talk about it more in the top reads of the year. Next is Dolphins of Altair, which is by Margaret St. Clair, who's a really interesting character. I know Melanie and Lisa at Monster She Wrote are really into Margaret St. Clair, and I think they're doing a bunch of research about her that's eventually going to come out on the podcast. I've talked to them about Margaret St. Clair. But The Dolphins of Altair is a very weird ecological sci-fi novel from the 60s. It's kind of like a super pulp version of the same thing, or it's a similar plot to Mountains in the Sea by Ray Naylor, but way, way weirder and pulpier. Um, it do I recommend it? If you're serious about your weird, out of date sci-fi, then yes. But most people, I would say, unless you're like really into the old weird stuff, don't bother. And that would go for the next one, which is Destruction of the Temple by Barry N. Malzberg. Barry Malzberg, unfortunately, just passed away within the last week. I'm still smarting from that. He's one of my literary heroes. The Destruction of the Temple is a very weird science fiction novel, surrealist novel about the end of the world and the Kennedy assassination and time travel. And it's a really weird book. Um, I did bring it up with him in the last interview. I don't know if it's the last interview he did, but the last interview he did with us at Dickheads last summer, I did bring up this book. And yeah, we interviewed Barry last summer, just a couple months before, probably about 6 months before he died. So, and that was my second time interviewing Barry, but I think it's the better of the two interviews. Even though he was a few years older, I actually think he was a little sharper in that one. But that's just me. So April was an interesting month because April was when I traveled home to Indiana to do the People's Park book release party and travel home for the solar eclipse, which was amazing. So it's at some point here we'll get to the books I read on that trip, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But towards the end of March, excuse me, I read The Intruder by Charles Beaumont, which is a mainstream thriller by longtime Twilight Zone writer Charles Beaumont. And The Intruder is a fantastic novel about segregation. It was made, Roger Corman directed a movie of it that you can get on YouTube and like Tubi, but I know you can get it on YouTube. And interesting trivia note: the two racist rednecks in the movie who burned down a church are the authors of Logan's Run, William F. Nolan and George Clayton Johnson playing the racist rednecks. William Nolan has actually a bunch of lines because he was from Missouri and he knew how to do it. And yeah, The Intruder is an incredible novel. It's very good. It hasn't totally aged awesome, but yeah, yeah, and Charles Beaumont was a great short story author, wrote a lot, about 12 episodes of Twilight Zone. Fantastic. Next, I read A Man Lies Dreaming by Lavi Tadar. And this is a like a noir detective novel that's set in an alternate London where the Nazi regime never happened and Hitler became like a gumshoe detective in London. And if that sounds bananas, it's because it is, and it's very good. Man Lies Dreaming by Lavi Tadar. Next, for the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, featuring we read Microcosmic God by Theodore Sturgeon, and I know Gary Wolfe and Cora Bullard were in that episode. I think Bill Higgins might have been in that episode too. But yeah, that's the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, so you can go hear my coverage on that. Microcosmic God is also the first science fiction story that Gene Wolfe read. That was his first contact with science fiction. Um, Also in April, right before I left for the solar eclipse, I read Day of the Burning by Barry Malzberg. And this one is influenced by Barry's time working as a social security like social worker for the social security system, and he did some social work in the 60s, and it inspired a lot of his fiction in a lot of different ways. But this one has a social security clerk who's basically told, you get to decide whether the human race is worthy of surviving or not. It's a very funny science fiction book. It's very good. I liked it a lot. I did talk to Barry about this one a lot in that last interview. And I know I had read these two Barry Malzberg books close together because I knew we were going to be interviewing him eventually. So I think those were part of my prep for that. So there's a lot of books here in April because April was I did traveling. When I travel, I read as I sit in the airport and all that. I read a lot of books. So on my way to Indiana for the solar eclipse, on my way there in one sitting, basically, I reread The World of Null A by A.E. von Vogt, and then immediately went into reading Solar Lottery by Philip K. Dick. And eventually I would read, and I read those two books because they were two of three books, including Barry Malzberg's The Gamesman, which I'll get to later. I had wanted to do a podcast episode about them, but I couldn't get anybody else to commit to reading three books in time to do it. And so I turned it into a article for Amazing Stories from my 25th Century Five and Dime column called The Games Machine Trilogy, which covers all three. But I read those first two just on my flight to Indiana. And I was able to read, I think I flew through Denver, but between the airport and the first flight, I finished World of Null, and I read it before. And then on the second part of the flight to Indiana, and then waiting for my ride at the airport in Indianapolis, I was sitting in the airport in Indianapolis when I finished Solar Lotteries. I read both those on the way there. Around the same time I started walking to work again because I moved, switched jobs, and I was walking to work listening to the audiobook of The Lesser Dead by Christopher Buehlman, which is a great vampire novel. The audiobook read by the author is incredible. That was a suggestion by Judge Mark Rothenberg, who joins me on, that was one of his best reads of the year before. And so I added it to my list, and it was great. Then I read Zone of Emptiness by Hiroshi Noma, which is a Japanese literature novel about World War II that Philip K. Dick listed as a influence. And yeah, I don't know how it influenced him, but I gave it a shot. And then on the way, now the reviews are a little bit out of order because on the way back from Indiana, I read Womb City by Totolo Tamasi. I think that's how you pronounce it, a Ugandan science fiction writer. And I've seen some very positive reviews of this. This was a book that it was about 400 pages, and the first 200 pages I was really into it, and I was really going for it. And I don't know if I was just like in a daze because of like having just like seen a solar eclipse and all that. But on the flight back, and I guess I was tired. Um, uh, my flight got canceled. I had to spend the night in the airport, and most of that night I was reading this book, and I started to feel like I kind of lost the thread on this one. I kind of felt like there was a lot of um, stuff that was confusing to me in the second half of the book, and I just lost the thread. It just didn't work for me. But you might like it better. All for African science fiction. I've read a lot of good African science fiction, and I like international science fiction. So yeah. Um, so next I read or I listened to, after I finished the audiobook of The Lesser Dead, I listened to an audiobook of The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester, which was a reread because I've read that book before. And I didn't really enjoy it as much as an audiobook. I liked reading it when I read it in the past. Again, the audiobook, sometimes I lose that thread, you know. Then I read Spin a Black Yarn by Josh Mellerman. It's the last book I read in April. And this was right before I interviewed him for this book, and it's incredible. Spin a Black Yarn. He won the World Fantasy Award for um, Half the House is Haunted, and deservedly so. And I love talking to Josh about process, and I love the discussion about that. There's a science fiction novella in there called Jupiter Drop, and it makes me wish Josh would write more science fiction. So I'd like to put the call out that I want him to do that. So um, yeah, that's April. So May. I might have to take a break here soon. Um, I Can See Your Lies, the first novel by filmmaker Izzy Lee. Had her on the podcast to talk about it. It's a really cool horror novel. Cannot wait to see her horror movie House of Ashes. I don't have much more to say about that one other than that I really want to see her movie, and I'm hearing great things. So yeah, Izzy is pretty cool. I like Izzy a lot. So I've had her on the podcast twice, once to talk about the funding campaign for House of Ashes, and then to cover this novel. Next in May, May was probably the shortest uh, amount of books I read in a month. And this had to do with I was doing a lot of extra prep for getting ready for StokerCon was coming to San Diego, and I was one of the lead volunteers in charge of panels. So I had that going on. So I after I Can See Your Lies, I read Among the Living by Tim Levin, which was awesome. I love Tim Levin. I love everything that he does. Most years this would make a top 10 of the year list. But it's just such a good year. Among the Living is great Arctic horror. It's just really good sci-fi horror. Then I read Star Wars: The Living Force by John Jackson Miller. Um, it was good. I don't really have much of a memory for it. Sometimes the Star Wars book's gonna go. There wasn't anything in it that like really stuck home with me. I invited him on the podcast, but he said he couldn't come on for like 2 months, and so just by that time, uh, yeah, the moment was gone. So hopefully get John back on for something else too, because I've really enjoyed some of his Star Trek novels. Then the Jinbot of Shantiport by Samet Basu, which is a Indian sci-fi retelling of Aladdin, and it's pretty good. I liked it. Maybe 100 pages too long, which is a lot. So it could have been shorter. Next was a horror movie by Paul Tremblay, and it's Paul Tremblay. It's really good. It's a weird, partially a screenplay, partially like cursed horror movie narrative. and I got to read it right before he came out for uh, StokerCon. I think I did an interview with him about. See, I know I talked to Paul at StokerCon about this book. I think we did a podcast about it, but if not, we did Survivor Song. So you can definitely check out the interview I did with Paul about Survivor Song for sure. Um, and Paul Bearer's Club. We talked about Paul Bearer's Club for sure. I think we did. Did I do horror movie? That's really weird. I can't even remember if I did that or not. In June, Kindred Blood in Kensington Gore. Philip K. Dick in the Afterlife, an imaginary conversation by Paul W. Aldous. So Aldous is most remembered for writing the story that Spielberg's and Kubrick's AI was based on. And but science fiction fans know him because he was one of the best British horror or science fiction writers of the new wave. He wrote Hot House, which is a classic, and Frankenstein Unbound, which was made into a Roger Corman movie, Dracula Unbound, and Halconian Fall, Summer, and Winter. He's written lots of really classic stuff, but he was a big Philip K. Dick fan. He wrote the introduction to one of the special editions of Martian Time Slip. And so he did an early Philip K. Dick festival in England in the 90s. And he wrote this one act play where it's him having a conversation with the ghost of Philip K. Dick. And so my thoughts are on the blog. I don't remember it super well. Um, it's interesting getting his perspective on PKD because he has a very different perspective than I do. There's some things that I'm like, well, now we know more about Phil than Brian Aldiss would have known at the time because this was even before Divine Invasions came out, the Sutton biography. So next, I read Dreammakers: Uncommon Men and Women Who Write Science Fiction, Volume One by Charles Platt. This was a interesting set of interviews. Charles Platt puts himself into the interviews in really funny and weird ways. This is a must-have book for folks interested in the history of science fiction. If you're not a big nerd for science fiction history, you don't need to read this one. So yeah. And at this point, StokerCon had already happened, and I was preparing for PKD Fest in Colorado. So we're coming up on my interview with Jonathan Lethem. So I read The Feral Detective by Jonathan Lethem because I went to my local used bookstore and said, hey, I need a Jonathan Lethem book to get signed. And the one I chose was The Feral Detective, which was written right after Trump got elected in 2016. And it's kind of this LA noir story, but also weird story about tribalism in America. And it's very good. And Jonathan was super cool. But we'll get to that. Then I read Fina by Nino Capuri, which was a sci-fi novella that's kind of a spoof of IKEA's. It's about somebody lost in an IKEA that transports you through time as you get lost in the store. It's pretty funny. Okay, then I left for my Colorado trip to go to. So I had one flight to Denver early in the morning. And the book I chose to read on the way to PKD Fest was Flux by Ron Goulart, who Ron is, of course, who Phil was writing the formula letter to, his letter about the PKD formula. And Ron Goulart wrote very kind of tongue-in-cheek, funny political science fiction. And Flux is about a planet where kids are protesting the colonialization of other worlds by blowing themselves up. And they're called the Suicide Kids. And the main characters are shape-shifting spies. So it's a really weird and fun book. And the other book I read on the way there and back, mostly on the way back, was Philip K. Dick Essays of the Here and Now, edited by David Sandiner, professor at Cal State Fullerton. And most of the essays in this book were papers that were presented at Philip K. Dick Fest in Fullerton in 2012, I think it was, or 2016. I'm not sure. Anyways, it was a few years ago. It's a really cool book. It's got really good essays on Philip K. Dick. So if you're somebody who needs or wants all the information about Philip K. Dick, that's there. The review didn't get posted till July, but I read that in June on the way back. And one of the books I picked up there was my buddy at the Philip K. Dick Festival was staying across the hallway from me at the hotel was James Reich. And he gave me a signed copy of A Moth for Stars, his weird surrealist kind of Great Depression era horror novel. It's very, very good. But his we'll talk about James's other book that he kind of previewed for me when we were hanging out at PKD Fest. And for those who don't know, PKD Fest was really cool. We interviewed for Dickheads, Jonathan Lethem and Stephen Graham Jones. You can find that on our YouTube, and it's live from PKD Fest, and I was just hanging out with all the dickheads, and we went to Phil's grave in Colorado, and then we saw Phil's mother's childhood homes in Greeley, Colorado. That was really weird. So yeah, crazy PKD experience. So in July, I read Jump Knots, a science fiction novel by Hao Jingfang, who she is a very popular science fiction author in China. And I loved her novel Vagabonds. Jump Knots just inched into my top reads of the year. It gets some curve grading because it's Chinese science fiction. I love Chinese science fiction. I like science fiction from another cultural context. And this is kind of like Ancient Astronauts, the Chinese version that mixes with Chinese history. So yeah, I love that. Very cool. Okay, so next for the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, I read Nightfall by Isaac Asimov. That episode features the author of Astounding, Alec Neville Lee, and one of my favorite podcast friends, Seth Heasley of Who Goes There and Take Me to Your Reader. And I really love that episode. So Nightfall by Isaac Asimov. Guess what? It's a classic for a reason. It's good. Then I read A Bright and Beautiful Eternal World by James Chambers. James is one of my homies from the horror community. I love James. He's great. And this is his cosmic horror collection, all set in a weird fictional town in Long Island. Very good stuff. Bright and Beautiful Eternal World by James Chambers. So if you like cosmic horror, Lovecraftian stuff, definitely read that. Next, I listened to an audiobook of Star Wars Dark Disciple by Christine Golden. This is the backstory for this was supposed to be episodes of the Clone Wars. The scripts ended up not getting made. It got turned into this novel. Is the story of Asajj Ventress and I'm brain farting his name. The Jedi that Voss, I think. I don't remember. He's the one that Obi-Wan like sees a symbol in the TV show, so he kind of makes reference to him. So Asajj Ventress and this Jedi have this kind of like he kind of goes undercover to try and kill Count Dooku, and ends up falling in love with Asajj Ventress. And the idea of him falling in love with this like Sith assassin, this Jedi, it shouldn't work. It's the best love story in Star Wars, hands down. I'm not kidding. It's really good. Next, I read for the podcast Radio Free Albemuth, the last published science fiction novel of Philip K. Dick. It was posthumously published. He did not this was a lost manuscript when he was alive. It was an early version of Valis. We recorded an episode of Dickheads that at the time of this recording is not out yet, but we've already recorded it with Lisa Morton, former president of the HWA, who adapted Radio Free Albemuth into a play. So she's a great guest for the Dickheads podcast. Speaking of Dickheads, for Dickheads Only editor, Professor David Gill, or he was a professor. David Gill, in Time's Empire, We Are All Slaves. This is a very short collection of kind of mostly flash fiction, microfiction pieces by David Gill, and they're really good, neat little science fiction pieces. David should write more. And that would be cool to see him do that. Speaking of collections, I've got Shrouded Horror by Casey Griffant, who is she's a author here in San Diego, and did a whole episode with Christina that is up on the podcast feed, and she writes really good horror, so it's a very good horror collection. Definitely read that. The next audiobook I listened to was The Babysitter Lives by Stephen Graham Jones, and I'm not gonna say a lot about this, but this is a haunted house audio original, so you have to listen to an audiobook of it. I love the setup. It's very good. It's second best Stephen Graham Jones I read this year. And I had just come off hanging out with Stephen at PKD Fest and StokerCon, so it was really exciting to listen to that. And I really enjoyed the audiobook of that. A lot of walking to and from work listening to that. Next is a collection called Psychoactive Transformative Horror Novellas by my homies, Ryan C. Thomas, Anthony Trevino, Cody Goodfellow, and Ed Kurtz. I don't know Ed, but I know the other guys are all San Diego authors and friends. Did an episode about that. I have a lot of respect for all three of those authors, so of course I really enjoyed that. Then I read Vintage Season. This is a novella by Lawrence O'Donnell, aka Catherine Lucille Moore. This is a classic science fiction novella about time travel, and it looks like it's a haunted house story at first, but it's not. It's time travel. It's a classic for a reason. I will talk more about it in the top reads of the year. Next, I read Future Perfect, American Science Fiction of the 19th Century by Howard Bruce Franklin. He was a science fiction researcher who died this year. And when he died, I read about his work and saw that the library had this. So I put a hold on that at the library and read it. It's a cool book because it has fiction from the 19th century and then articles about it. And one of the coolest things I read in there was a book set a short story set 1,000 years in the future by Edgar Allan Poe about a balloon ride in the year 3000. It's a very interesting book. In August, I read The Little Book of Aliens by Adam Frank, which is a nonfiction book about, what aliens could be like, what the search for aliens could be. A little disappointed in this book. I've really enjoyed Adam Frank as a guest on podcasts. Then I read, for the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, read The Weapons Shop by A.E. Von Vogt. That episode is up. It features Dickheads, David Gill, and Keith Giles, who have both already been mentioned in this episode. They joined me as Dickheads who had never read much A.E. Von Vogt, because of course A.E. Von Vogt was one of Phil's biggest influences. Speaking of Philip K. Dick, the next thing I read was The Collected Stories of Philip K. Dick, Volume 1. And I read that to write the Dickopedia entries, which are about 20 pages worth and 6,000 words of collected entry. I mean, there's not 6,000 words from the dictionary. There's 6,000 words to type it up, including like the information in the dictionary entries. So Yeah, so this is the very first collection of PKD books, and I'm doing all five eventually. Um, then I read Shallow Ends by David James Keaton, whose Head Cleaner was one of my favorite reads of last year. And this is a really fun, kind of bizarro horror, sci-fi. I don't know, man, it's a lot of things, but it's about well, you know what? It's better if you go into a cold. But I did a whole episode on this. Had David on. It was one of the most tangenty. We lost the thread in the conversation a lot of times, and I really appreciated that David read my book last night, To Kill Nazis, and started asking me questions about my book. So he wins some points for that. And Shallow Ends is about a party bus on an old fire truck, and it won't stop. And from there, madness ensues. Then I read You Like It Darker by Stephen King. Have you ever heard of this guy? Yeah, it's the short story collection, the latest short story collection by Stephen King, and the opening novella is great. The whole thing's good. Stephen King, the short form, cannot mess with him. Rattlesnakes, the kind of sequel to Cujo. It's very good. But there's a short novel worth story. It's 200 pages about a man wrongly accused of a crime that I don't remember the name of it, but that was really good. And yeah, I was a big fan of that. Then Mimsy Where the Burrow Grows by C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner. And that was for Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. And that episode featured Cora Bullard and Brian Collins, I believe. Yeah, yeah. Good episode. Yeah, so that's the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. Also on the podcast, the last book I read in August, A Better World by Sarah Langan. I'm going to talk more about this in the top reads of the year, but this is a great science fiction novel by Sarah Langan. Really loved it. Cool stuff going on there. Yeah, so September, we're getting towards the end. I read A Door into Ocean by Joan Solonsky. Joan, if I pronounce your name wrong, I'm so sorry. She came on the podcast to talk about this book. The reason why is I was on a panel about A Door into Ocean and ecofeminism at the speculative fiction across media conference in LA, which is a great conference in October, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. Um, and it's a really good conference, and I was on a panel, so I read this book for it. It's great, ecofeminist. It's like Dune, but it's like Dune meets Avatar Way of Water, and with like some like really good progressive nonviolent politics, nonviolent resistance politics. Very good. And a very detailed review up. I have an episode on A Door to Ocean here on the podcast, which you can listen to. And then we did the panel at the conference. Very good stuff. And I have Brain Plagues by Joan sitting on my TBR right now, right underneath my knee. Excuse me, my knees here at my desk. Very much looking forward to reading that. Next, Darker Side of Earth by Alfred Bester. This is a short story collection by Alfred Bester. And the truth is that I started that book in February when I was still working at my old job. And so when somewhere, at some point, I left it at my old job. And until I went back and subbed there in June, between February and June, it sat at my old work with my bookmarks still in it. And then I had almost finished it. So I didn't even write a review of it because between the time that I started it and when I finished it, it was so long. But Alfred Bester is great. His short stories are great. I just didn't feel qualified to write a review of it. So in September, I also read Letters to C. L. Moore and Others by H.P. Lovecraft and C. L. Moore. Um, Listen, Catherine Lucille Moore is classic science fiction writer who grew up in Indiana. I'm working on trying to get a plaque put in the building where she used to work. And she typed up stories for Robert Bloch and H.P. Lovecraft, and Robert Howard, and wrote her own classic stories and dropped them in the mail slot at the building. The mail slot's still there in Indianapolis. I'm working on getting a plaque there. These letters are incredible. They tell her history, and it's like commentary between the two, between her and Lovecraft. It's if you're a nerd for this stuff, like I am, it's a really must read. Okay, and the next audiobook I read, and one of the best books of the year, was Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. And I loved Bury Your Gaze. It was the best audiobook I listened to of the year. Well, Lesser Dead, I thought that was the year before when I was thinking that. Lesser Dead might have been a little bit better production of an audiobook. I kind of wish I had actually read Bury Your Gaze. There's a lot going on. It was kind of an impulse checkout on my Libby app. And then I got hooked. I think this is really great science fiction horror. It's a really clever idea that deals with AI and all the things that we're dealing with now. And it's great. LGBTQ horror, awesome stuff. Next, I read David Tui's unproduced Alien 3 script for an episode we did of the podcast here with Issa and Anthony. So you can hear that podcast. I'm not going to go into it much. It's better than the final movie that got made. Also on the podcast, Forgotten Sisters by Cynthia Paleo. Cynthia Paleo. Forgotten Sisters is great. Folklore, horror, really cool stuff. Then I read Good Men Do Nothing by John Brunner, which is his kind of black James Bond ripoff from the 60s. I realized it was book 2 in a series after I had already started it. So some of it didn't make a lot of sense. I don't really feel super qualified to review that until I've read book 1. So we'll see. Then also on the podcast. Oh, and by the way, the Cynthia Paleo episode on Forgotten Sisters is very good. You should definitely listen to that. Devils Kill Devils by Johnny Compton. I did an episode with Johnny too. That is a really cool monster book. And with a really cool first act. The first act is very, very, very good. Then I read Philip K. Oh, wait, no. Then I read Why Call Them Back from Heaven by Clifford Samack, which is one of the coolest retro reads I've read of the year, which is a really interesting philosophical science fiction novel about immortality written in the 60s. I will talk more about that in the Best Reads of the Year episode. Philip K. Dick, The Dream Connection, edited by D. Scott Appel, which is a whole book of a transcripts of an interview with Philip K. Dick. I have a couple of those books. There's a few things that are really good and important in it. I wouldn't necessarily have done the interview they did, but it is what it is. In October, I read Not a Speck of Light by Laird Barron. I will talk more about that in the Best Reads of the Year episode. Also in the Best Reads of the Year episode, Skinship by James Reich, which was a book that he first teased to me, having conversations at the PKD festival. James did an amazing job. I also just released an episode with James talking about that. Also on the podcast, so these are 3 in a row that I covered on the podcast. American Rapture by C.J. Lead, very good, weird post-apocalyptic horror novel about sexual repression. And then the book I read on my way to the Speculative Fiction Across Media Conference in Los Angeles on the train in one sitting, I read The Man Who Folded Himself by David Gerald. And I will talk more about that in my retro reads, but that is an absolutely incredible time travel novel. If you are in a situation where you have a long flight or a long plane flight or something, train ride, This is a book that is about 170 pages, and it's best if you can read it in one sitting. Trust me. Plan to read it, and that it's a classic. It deserves to be read, and supposedly, according to David Gerald, Barry Malzberg saved it from the slush pile, and something that Barry downplayed. But David Gerald said that to me when I interviewed him a couple years back. Then also on the podcast, wow, look at that. I've interviewed all 5 authors for the podcast um, that I read in October. That's odd. Okay. Well, David Gerald I interviewed a couple of years ago, not this year. Good Dogs by Brian Asman, which I read um, partially on the way to the conference in LA, during the conference in LA, and on the way home. And Good Dogs is great. It's a werewolf novel by San Diego homie Brian Asman. Got a whole episode on it. You should definitely go and listen to that. It's like a slasher novel if the slasher kills werewolves. November, I read the summer 2024 edition of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, edited by Sherry Renee Thomas. Yeah, I remember that issue had a first time or a relatively new author, the cover story, and I can't remember. It was good. The magazine and fantasy and science fiction is always good. It's always good stuff. Then I finished reading. Now I had been reading. One of the reasons why I read less books in October is because I was slowly working my way through a 600-page book called The Rutledge Handbook of Co-Futurisms, edited by Tarnay Jade Taylor, Bod Vista Chatope, Grace L. Dillon, and Isaiah Lavender. Sorry, the third. Sorry if I butcher any of those names. This is this massive, I'm touching it, but I'm not going to pull it off my shelf. This massive tome of books about indigenous and first culture and, you know, cultural science fiction, international science fiction, indigenous science fiction. It's a book about modern science fiction, basically, and it's a textbook, and it's great. And in contrast to that, I read Science Fiction and Oral History by D. Scott Appel. Mostly, I wanted to read the C.L. Moore interview, which was kind of a letdown. The Lee Brackett interview was okay. The Norman Spinrad interviews in here are really, really good and caused a lot of discussion in the PKD hangouts that we have every Tuesday night with all the PKD scholars. And Spinrad basically predicted, or he said that he thought Philip K. Dick would be remembered more than Kurt Vonnegut, which was a bold statement to make in the early 70s. And even the idea that Phil would be remembered was a bold statement in the 70s. And Spinrad was on it, and he knew, and he was right. It was a bold statement at the time. Next, and I read that. I read almost all of that in one sitting on the train going to Ojai to visit Ojai, California, a town that my wife and I loved visiting. Shout out to Hit Vegan, great restaurant there. The other book I read well on the way there and well, I was hanging around Ojai was The Marrow Thieves by Sherry Demoline, which I read about in the Co-Futures book. And that's a really good Canadian Indigenous weird apocalypse novel. And then one of the books I bought while I was in Ojai at Bart's Books, shout out to Bart's Books, is Fury by Henry Kuttner, the 40s classic science fiction novel. And it's very 40s, and it's good, weird Venus set, Venus that could never exist, like a fantastical Venus of the 40s. Yeah, Fury by Henry Kuttner, really fun read. And then after that, like a week after going to Ojai, I went to BizarroCon in Astoria, Oregon. Shout out to BizarroCon. I was nominated for Best Novel for The Last Night to Kill Nazis. Did not win. That's okay. But I taught a workshop on writing in the Philip K. Dick formula. That was on a Sunday morning and still had 35 people at it, which was pretty cool. Did a reading from my novel People's Park, and that went really well. And the book that I read in one sitting on the flight to Portland was Make It Stop by Jim Ruland. Um, uh, and I did a episode with Jim on the podcast about that book. It's great, and I will talk more about it on the Top Reads episode. I also on that trip started the third rule of time travel by Philip Fracassi. But in between, right before the trip, I finished. This is why it was out. I have these out of order. Before I left for the trip, I finished Angel of Indian Lake by Stephen Graham Jones, the third in the Jade Daniels trilogy. Um, Don't Fear the Reaper is my favorite of the Jade Daniels trilogy, and I'm not a massive fan of these books. I love Stephen Graham Jones; he's great, but I'm not a big slasher guy, so these books don't like work particularly well for me. But I mean, it's well written. It's not my thing. Speaking of well written but not my thing, The Twilight of the Gods by Kurt Baumeister, who wrote fantastic Pax Americana a few years ago for Stalking Horse Press. The Twilight of the Gods by Kurt Baumeister is very funny, but it's mostly like kind of a spoof of Nordic gods and Loki and that kind of thing. And it is just not a topic that interests me very much. So even though I can tell it was really well written, um, it didn't. I think there's some of you out there who will like this book a lot more than me. And so if a humorous book about Norse gods and Loki and all that sounds good to you, then definitely check it out. But next, I did read The Third Rule of Time Travel by Philip Fracassi, which comes out next March. And it's a very Matheson esque science fiction novel. And yeah, I really liked it. And I'm going to talk more about it in the top reads of the year. So I'm not going to talk much about it now. We're almost done, folks. I also wrote a book called Codename Nemo, which was a nonfiction book for research. So I'm not going to talk much about that. For upcoming novel I'm writing. And I read Good Night, Sleep Tight by Brian Evanson, his short story collection. What can I say? He's the best short story writer on the planet. I will talk more about that in Top Reads of the Year episode, because it's that good. He's Brian Evanson. He's the best short story writer on the planet. One of the books I picked up at Bizarro Con because he was my ride from the well, not from the airport. I met him at Paradox Cafe, but my ride from Portland to Astoria was Jason Rios. And so I read his book, Prom Night on the River of Death, which is kind of a transgressive, weird um, uh, dystopia-ish. I put a review up in there. It's funny because it's not totally my thing, but it's very good. I would like to see Jason write a straight up science fiction novel. Next, I read Colonialism and the Emergence of Science Fiction, which is I was reading that over Thanksgiving break, so that's how close we are getting to the end of the year. Um, this is a nonfiction book about 19th century science fiction and colonialism. Then I read the Big Trouble in Little China 2 script for the episode of the podcast that did with Isa and Anthony. You can go listen to that. Then I read Riot Baby by Takashi Anawabe. I'm butchering his name. That is a great science fiction novel. I didn't put his name down here and I should have. So Riot Baby is great. I liked his novel Goliath a little bit more. Probably because there was more to it, but Riot Baby is fantastic. Black Rage, science fiction. Then I read Arena by Frederick Brown for the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, which is an episode that is up featuring Sarah Lynn Mishner and Issa Diao, my Star Trek bridge crew. And then Fragile by Michael Allen Rose. I've already recorded an episode about Fragile. This is an anthology. This all starts with one short story prompt. What's in the box? And I'm gonna have a whole episode about that, but you should read it. It's a great anthology by Michael Allen Rose. Then one of the best self-published novels I've ever read, Boris Says the Words by Kyle Winkler. Um, Again, recorded an episode on it. It's not out yet. It will be out soon. Highly recommend. This is an incredible, weird sci-fi horror, bizarro hybrid, high literature, very smart. Sheep look up PKD influence. Boris Says the Words by Kyle Winkler. Get it, read it, then you'll be ahead of the curve by the time my episode comes out. I read a Star Trek graphic novel called Godshocked, which is about the return of Ben Sisko, and he puts together a crew and starship, and it's good. It's a little weird, but yeah, I like it. I read a book for research called When Paris Went Dark by Ronald C. Rosbottom. I'm still kind of working my way through that. I just finished a Star Trek The Next Generation audiobook, Shadows Have Offended by Cassandra Rose Clark. It has a lot of Betazoid stuff in it, and that is my least favorite culture in Star Trek, so kind of bored by that. And then last and certainly not least, probably one of the best books I read this year. We'll talk more about it in the top reads of the year is Buffalo Hunter Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones. I just got the arc like a week ago, read it, and wowzers, it is amazing. Totally amazing. And then the last thing I'm going to read before the end of the year, I haven't started it yet, but I've got a couple days left, is I'm going to start. Oh, and I didn't, somewhere in there, I read the PKD volume 2, the short story collections. And I'm going to read volume 3 here before the end of the year. I'm going to start it. And because I'm also going to be on an episode of a live book club from the Mark Twain branch of the LA Library, doing Second Variety by Philip K. Dick, teaching Second Variety. So I got to reread that. So that'll be the last thing I read of the year. That and Buffalo Hunter Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones, which is great. And I've gone an hour. That's everything I read this year. The best books, I'll be talking about it with Mark Rothenberg in the best books of the year, recording tomorrow afternoon. So pretty soon after this comes out, that'll come out. You'll get more details, but you get kind of a preview. So thank you for joining me. I can't believe you listened to this whole thing, but if you did, yeah, it was a good year. It's a good year for reading. Don't know if I will read as many next year. I will try. Okay. See you next time. Bye.